For 72 hours, Ghost stood at the fence screaming into the wilderness, and Jake knew with bone-deep certainty that something was dying out there. The 6 skeletal foals he found in that hidden barn had less than 24 hours left to live. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jake Mercer had seen a lot of strange things in his 47 years working cattle across the Montana high country, but he'd never seen his albino mare act the way she was acting now. Ghost, as he'd named her for that pure white coat that seemed to glow in moonlight, stood at the fence line of his ranch, her ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as she stared into the darkening wilderness beyond his property. She'd been doing this for 3 days straight, refusing her grain, barely touching her hay, just standing there as if something out in those pine-covered hills was calling to her in a language only she could understand. The November wind cut through Jake's worn leather jacket as he walked across the frozen ground toward her, his boots crunching on the first frost of the season. At 62, he'd learned to trust his animals' instincts more than his own sometimes. Horses knew things, sensed things that human beings had forgotten how to feel. Ghost had been with him for 8 years now, ever since he'd pulled her half dead from a stock trailer at an auction, her ribs showing through that remarkable white coat, her eyes dull with neglect and despair. She'd been 3 years old then, already marked as worthless by men who valued flash over substance, speed over heart. Jake had seen something different. He'd seen intelligence in those pink-rimmed eyes, a spirit that hadn't quite been broken despite everything she'd endured. He'd paid $200 for her, money he couldn't really afford at the time, and brought her home to his small ranch tucked into the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains. It had taken him 6 months to get her to trust him, another year before she'd let him ride her. Now she was the best cow horse he'd ever owned, with an instinct for working cattle that couldn't be taught, only born into the blood and bone of an animal that understood its purpose. But this behavior was something new, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Ghost turned her head as he approached, nickering softly, that low, rumbling sound horses make when they're trying to communicate something important. Her whole body was tense, vibrating with an energy that seemed barely contained. Jake ran his weathered hand along her neck, feeling the muscles bunched tight beneath that silky coat. "Where you trying to go, girl?" he asked quietly, his voice rough from years of talking more to animals than people. "What's out there that's got you so worked up?" Ghost stamped her front hoof, turned her head toward the wilderness again, then looked back at Jake with an expression so human, so pleading, that it sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. In all their years together, he'd never seen her like this. She was trying to tell him something, trying to make him understand with every fiber of her being that something out there needed them. Jake had lived alone on this ranch for 15 years, ever since his wife Sarah had lost her battle with cancer. Their daughter lived in Seattle now, had her own life, her own family. She called once a week, visited twice a year, and he knew she worried about him out here by himself. But this ranch, these mountains, the animals he tended, they'd become his world, his purpose, his reason for getting up every morning when the darkness tried to pull him back down into the grief that never quite went away. He'd always been a practical man, not given to flights of fancy or supernatural thinking. But standing there in the gathering dusk with his hand on Ghost's neck, feeling her urgency, her desperate need to make him understand, Jake made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow morning, before first light, he'd saddle her up and let her take him wherever she was so determined to go. If there was something out there in those hills, something that had captured her attention so completely, then by God he was going to find out what it was. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay in the darkness of the bedroom he'd once shared with Sarah, listening to the wind rattling the windows, thinking about Ghost's strange behavior. His ranch sat on 300 acres of decent grazing land, bordered on the north by national forests that stretched for hundreds of miles into wilderness so remote that some of it had never been properly mapped. People got lost in those mountains every year. Some were found, some weren't. It was harsh country, beautiful but unforgiving, the kind of landscape that demanded respect and punished carelessness. Before you dive deeper into this story, tell us where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this tale of mystery and discovery, make sure you're subscribed because we've got more incredible stories coming your way. Jake rose before dawn, as he had every morning for decades. The coffee tasted bitter on his tongue as he stood at the kitchen window, watching the sky slowly lighten over the eastern peaks. He dressed in layers, knowing that November in Montana could shift from merely cold to life-threatening in a matter of hours. Thermal underwear, flannel shirt, heavy vest, his warmest jacket. He filled his saddlebags with supplies, water, jerky, matches, a space blanket, his pistol in case of mountain lions or bears, though most should be denning up by now. Ghost was waiting at the gate when he walked out to the barn, and there was something in her posture, an alertness, an eagerness that confirmed his decision to follow her instincts. He saddled her quickly, his fingers moving through the familiar motions even in the pre-dawn darkness. The leather creaked as he tightened the cinch, and Ghost stood perfectly still, none of her usual fidgeting, as if she understood the importance of what they were about to do. They set out as the first pale light touched the mountain peaks, turning them gold and rose against the deep purple sky. Ghost didn't hesitate, didn't wait for Jake to give her direction. The moment he settled into the saddle and loosened the reins, she was moving, heading north toward the forest boundary with a purpose that was almost frightening in its intensity. Jake let her have her head, trusting in whatever instinct was driving her forward. The temperature was barely above freezing, and his breath came out in white clouds that dissipated in the still morning air. They crossed his north pasture at a steady trot, Ghost's hooves thudding rhythmically against the frozen ground. A mule deer doe watched them pass, her ears swiveling to track their movement, before she bounded away into the timber ravens called from the pine trees, their harsh voices echoing across the landscape like warnings or prophecies. At the fence line that marked the boundary between his land and national forest, Jake dismounted to open the gate he maintained for accessing the backcountry. Ghost pushed through the moment the opening was wide enough, barely waiting for him to remount before she was moving again, faster now, her urgency communicating itself through every muscle and movement. Jake had ridden these mountains for decades, knew most of the game trails and old logging roads, but Ghost wasn't following any path he recognized. She was cutting through the forest with absolute certainty, as if following a map only she could see. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed, the trees thicker, the undergrowth more tangled. Jake had to duck low over Ghost's neck to avoid low-hanging branches that grabbed at his hat and jacket. The mare never wavered, never hesitated, picking her way through deadfall and around massive boulders with the sure-footedness that made her such a valuable mountain horse. They'd been riding for nearly 2 hours when the forest opened into a small meadow, brown and dormant in the late autumn cold. Ghost stopped so suddenly that Jake nearly lost his seat. She stood rigid, her head high, nostrils flaring as she tested the wind. Jake felt it too then, a change in the air, something that made his scalp prickle with primitive warning. The meadow was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels chattering in the trees, nothing but the whisper of wind through dead grass and the creaking of pine branches overhead. "Easy, girl," Jake murmured, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. Whatever Ghost sensed, it had put her on high alert, and he'd learned long ago to take such signals seriously. They moved forward more slowly now, Ghost placing each hoof with deliberate care, her ears swiveling constantly to catch any sound that might indicate danger. On the far side of the meadow, half hidden by a stand of aspen trees whose leaves had long since fallen, Jake saw something that made his heart skip a structure. Old, weathered, half collapsed, but unmistakably man-made. A barn, or what was left of one, its roof sagging in the middle, its walls listing at angles that defied physics. Jake had explored these mountains extensively over the years, had never seen or heard of any building this deep in the back country. Someone had built it long ago, back when these forests were being logged, perhaps, or when homesteaders were still trying to carve lives out of impossible wilderness. Ghost moved toward the barn without any urging from Jake, and now he could hear something that made his blood run cold. A sound so faint he almost missed it beneath the wind, a sound that shouldn't exist out here in this abandoned place, the high, thin wailing of something in distress. Not one voice, but several, weak and desperate and fighting for survival. Jake's mind raced through possibilities. Coyote pups. No, wrong season, and besides, coyotes didn't sound like that. Bear cubs. Again, wrong time of year, and their mother would have torn the barn apart getting to them. The sound came again, clearer now as they approached, and Jake felt his chest tighten with recognition and horror. Those were horses. Young horses' foals crying out in hunger and fear. He dismounted quickly, his knees protesting the sudden movement after hours in the saddle. Ghost nickered urgently, pushing past him toward the barn's partially collapsed entrance. Jake followed, his boots crunching on broken glass and rotted wood. The smell hit him first, sharp and acrid, the unmistakable odor of animals in distress, of urine and feces and fear. He pulled his bandana up over his nose and pushed through the opening, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the dimness inside. What he saw made him stop breathing. In the far corner of the barn, huddled together in a tight cluster, were 6 foals. Not newborns, but young, maybe 3 or 4 months old, their ribs showing through dull coats, their eyes enormous in gaunt faces. They were alive, but barely. One of them, a little bay with a white blaze, tried to struggle to its feet when it saw Jake, but its legs buckled, and it collapsed back onto the filthy straw. The others didn't even try to move, just watched him with expressions that held no hope, only the dull acceptance of creatures that had given up on rescue. Ghost pushed past Jake and went directly to the foals, her nose extended, making soft sounds deep in her throat. The foal's ears pricked forward weakly, and the smallest one, a chestnut with a flaxen mane, made a pitiful attempt to nurse from Ghost, its instincts still driving it to seek comfort and nourishment from any adult horse. Ghost stood perfectly still, allowing the contact, and Jake felt tears sting his eyes at the gentleness of the gesture. How long had they been here? Days? Weeks? And where were their mothers? Jake moved slowly around the barn, his practiced eye taking in the evidence of what had happened. There were water troughs, empty and dry, their surfaces coated with dust and cobwebs. Hay mangers hung on the walls, completely bare. In one corner, he found what he'd been dreading: 3 adult horses, mares, all dead, their bodies already being reclaimed by the processes of decay. He couldn't tell what had killed them, but they'd been dead for at least a week, maybe more. Someone had brought horses here, to this abandoned barn miles from anywhere, and then left them to die. Whether intentionally or through some catastrophe that prevented their return, the result was the same. These 6 foals had watched their mothers die, had cried out for help that never came, had slowly starved while winter approached, and the world forgot they existed, except Ghost hadn't forgotten. Somehow, impossibly, she'd known. She'd felt their distress across miles of wilderness, had understood that Jake was the one person who could save them, and had refused to give up until she'd brought him here. Jake pulled out his satellite phone, the one luxury he allowed himself for emergencies, and called the only person he could think of who might help. Doc Hartley answered on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep despite it being past 8 in the morning. Jake didn't waste time with pleasantries. He described what he'd found, where he was, and what he needed. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and Jake could picture the old veterinarian sitting up in bed, running calculations through his mind about supplies, transportation, and the likelihood of success. 6 foals, you said? Doc's voice had lost all traces of sleepiness. And they've been without food for how long? At least a week, maybe more. Their mothers are dead, Doc. They're starving. If we don't get them out of here today, we'll be burying 6 more. Another silence, then Doc's voice came back, firm and decisive. I'll make some calls. We're going to need pack horses, maybe a dozen volunteers, emergency supplies. Can you keep them alive until we get there? Jake looked at the huddled foals, at Ghost standing guard over them like a protective mother. I'll do whatever it takes. Give me your coordinates. We'll be there in 3 hours, maybe 4. In the meantime, if there's any water source nearby, get them drinking small amounts, slow and steady. Don't let them gorge or you'll kill them as surely as the starvation will. After the call ended, Jake set to work. He had 2 bottles of water in his saddlebags, and he used his bandana as a makeshift sponge, letting the foals suck moisture from the fabric. They were so weak that even this simple act exhausted them, but he could see the desperate need in their eyes, the way they reached for the water with trembling lips. The little chestnut, the one who had tried to nurse from Ghost, seemed the weakest. Its breathing was shallow and labored, and Jake wondered if it would survive long enough for help to arrive. While he waited, he explored the rest of the barn, looking for clues about who had brought these animals here and why the structure was older than he'd initially thought, probably dating back to the 1920s or 30s when there'd been a brief mining boom in these mountains. Someone had maintained it more recently, though. There were relatively new boards patching some of the walls, and in what had probably been a tack room, he found equipment that couldn't be more than a few years old: halters, lead ropes, buckets, all bearing the dust of recent abandonment, but not the deep decay of decades. On a shelf in the corner, he found something that made his jaw clench with anger. A ledger, the kind used for tracking breeding records. He flipped through the pages, his rage building with each entry. These weren't rescue horses or abandoned stock. They'd been deliberately bred, part of some scheme that he couldn't quite piece together from the cryptic notes. There were dates, pairings of mares and stallions identified only by numbers, and prices, large prices. Someone had been running an illegal breeding operation out here, far from prying eyes and regulatory oversight, but something had gone wrong. The last entry was dated 3 weeks ago, a single word scrawled across the page in what looked like panicked handwriting. Raid. Jake understood then. Whoever had been running this operation had gotten word that law enforcement was coming, had grabbed whatever they could and abandoned everything else, including 6 foals too young to travel, and their mothers who couldn't be moved quickly enough to escape detection. Ghost nickered from her position near the foals, and Jake returned to find one of them, a gray filly with a darker muzzle, trying to stand. She made it halfway up before her legs gave out, but there was determination in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The water was helping. They had a chance. Slim, but real. Jake sat down on an overturned bucket and began talking to them, his voice low and steady, the same tone he'd used with Ghost all those years ago when she'd been broken and afraid you're not alone anymore. He said quietly, "Help is coming. You just have to hold on a little longer." The sun climbed higher, warming the barn slightly, and Jake checked his watch every few minutes, willing time to move faster. He gave the foals more water, just a little at a time, watching carefully for any signs that they were taking too much too fast. The little chestnut had closed its eyes, and for a terrifying moment Jake thought it had died. But when he placed his hand gently on its side, he could feel the faint but steady beating of its heart. Ghost never left her post. She stood over the foals like a sentinel, occasionally lowering her head to sniff them or make soft, reassuring sounds. Jake had always known she was special, but watching her now, seeing the maternal instinct that had driven her to cross miles of wilderness to find these orphaned babies, he understood that she was something more than special. She was extraordinary. The sound of horses approaching reached them about 20 minutes before the rescue party actually arrived. Jake went to the barn entrance and saw the most beautiful sight of his life. Doc Hartley led the group, riding a sturdy quarter horse and trailing 2 pack animals loaded with supplies. Behind him came 12 more riders, people Jake recognized from town and neighboring ranches, all of them grim-faced and determined. They'd dropped everything to help save 6 foals they'd never met, horses that belonged to no one and everyone simultaneously. Doc dismounted with the stiffness of a man in his 70s who'd ridden farther than he probably should have. His weathered face was set in lines of professional concentration as he handed his reins to someone else and grabbed his medical bag from one of the pack horses. "Jake, show me what we've got." They worked quickly, Doc examining each foal with gentle but efficient hands, calling out instructions to his volunteers. Electrolyte solutions were mixed and administered through syringes, small amounts at first to avoid overwhelming systems that had been shutting down. Blankets were produced and wrapped around shivering bodies. One of the volunteers, a woman named Martha who ran a horse rescue operation down in the valley, had brought colostrum replacer and special foal formula, precious supplies that could mean the difference between life and death. The little chestnut worried them all. Its temperature was dangerously low, and Doc shook his head grimly as he listened to its heartbeat. "This one might not make it," he said quietly to Jake. "Even if we get it down to the clinic, the damage might be too severe." But Jake remembered Ghost's determination, her refusal to give up, and he made a decision. "We're not giving up on any of them. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, we're saving all 6. Doc looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we'd better get moving. We've got maybe a 4-hour ride back to civilization, and we need to do it before the temperature drops tonight." The logistics of moving 6 starving foals through mountain wilderness was something none of them had ever attempted before. They fashioned travois from the pack frames and blankets, creating makeshift stretchers that could be dragged behind the horses. Each foal was carefully loaded, secured with rope and padding to prevent injuries during transport. The gray filly who had tried to stand earlier was able to walk some, supported between 2 volunteers who moved at her pace, encouraging her with every step. The journey back was a nightmare of careful navigation and constant worry. Every 100 yards brought new challenges: fallen logs that had to be circumvented, steep grades that threatened to tip the travois, branches that snagged on the makeshift stretchers. The volunteers worked in shifts, 2 people staying with each foal while the others scouted ahead or brought up the rear. Jake rode point with Ghost, and the mare seemed to understand that speed had to be balanced with safety. She picked the smoothest routes, seeming to anticipate obstacles before they appeared. The little chestnut, secured on a travois behind Martha's big draft horse cross, made almost no sound during the journey. Its eyes were closed most of the time, its breathing so shallow that Martha had to keep checking to make sure it was still alive. Doc Hartley stayed close to that travois, his experienced eye constantly assessing, his weathered face growing more concerned with each passing hour. Twice they stopped to administer more fluids, to adjust blankets, to check vital signs that remained frighteningly weak. The gray filly that had shown such determination in the barn proved to be the strongest of the 6 after the first hour. She was walking on her own with only minimal support, her thin legs shaking but holding her weight. Her eyes were alert, taking in her surroundings with an intelligence that reminded Jake of Ghost at that age. This one was a survivor, he thought, watching her navigate a tricky section of trail with more grace than should have been possible given her condition. Around noon, they emerged from the dense forest into Jake's north pasture, and he'd never been so grateful to see his own land. The temperature was dropping as clouds moved in from the west, the kind of heavy gray clouds that promise snow before nightfall. They had maybe 3 hours of travel left to reach the veterinary clinic in town. 3 hours during which any of these foals could give up their fight for survival. Doc Hartley called a brief rest and the volunteers gathered in a circle, passing around thermoses of coffee and sharing energy bars. Jake stood apart with Ghost, his hand on her neck, drawing comfort from her steady presence. She'd done the impossible, led him to creatures no one else knew existed, and now they were in a race against time and nature to justify her faith in him. Martha approached, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "The chestnut's not going to make it to town," she said quietly. "Its temperature's still dropping despite the blankets. We need to make a decision." "What kind of decision?" Jake asked, though he knew what she was suggesting. "Whether to keep pushing it or let it go peacefully here. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is stop fighting when the battle's already lost." Jake looked at the tiny foal lying motionless on the travois, so fragile and broken that it seemed impossible it was still breathing. Then he looked at Ghost, at the albino mare who had refused to give up, who had known these babies needed help and had moved heaven and earth to get it for them. Ghost turned her head and looked directly at him, and in her eyes he saw something that made his decision clear. "We don't give up," he said firmly. "Doc, what would you need to save that foal if we could get it somewhere warm right now?" Doc Hartley scratched his jaw, considering heat. "Fluids, probably plasma if we can find a donor, round-the-clock monitoring." "Why? What are you thinking?" "My ranch is 20 minutes from here. I've got a heated barn, electricity, everything you'd need to set up a temporary clinic. The others can continue to town, but we bring the chestnut to my place and fight for it there." The veterinarian's eyes lit with understanding and respect. "That might just work. The stress of continuing to town could kill it anyway. At least at your place we can stabilize it, maybe give it a real chance." The group split, most continuing toward town with the 5 stronger foals, while Jake, Doc, Martha, and 2 other volunteers headed for Jake's ranch with the chestnut. They pushed as hard as they dared, and Ghost seemed to sense the urgency, moving faster while still maintaining the smooth gait that kept the travois from jostling too much. When they finally reached the barn, Jake had never been so grateful for the improvements he'd made over the years. The insulated walls, the radiant heating system, the spacious foaling stalls that Sarah had insisted on back when they dreamed of breeding horses themselves. They set up in the largest stall, hanging heat lamps and spreading thick bedding. Doc worked with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd spent 50 years saving animals everyone else had given up on. He inserted an IV line with hands that barely trembled despite his age, hung bags of fluids and electrolytes, wrapped the foal in heating blankets that Martha had rushed back to her truck to retrieve. The chestnut lay still through all of it, its breathing barely perceptible, its heartbeat faint and irregular. Ghost stood at the stall door, her head over the top rail, watching everything with those intelligent pink-rimmed eyes. Jake had moved her water and hay within reach, but she showed no interest in either. She was focused entirely on the struggling foal, making soft sounds deep in her throat, sounds Jake had never heard her make before. As night fell and snow began to drift past the barn windows, the small group settled in for what would likely be a long vigil. Martha made coffee on the small burner in Jake's tack room. The 2 other volunteers, ranch hands from a spread 30 miles south, took turns checking on the 5 foals that had made it to the clinic. The news from town was cautiously hopeful. All 5 were receiving treatment, responding to warmth and food, showing signs that they would survive. But the chestnut remained balanced on a knife's edge between life and death. Its temperature had stopped dropping, which Doc said was a positive sign, but it hadn't started rising either. The fluids were going in, being absorbed by a body that had nearly forgotten how to function. Every hour that passed without deterioration was a small victory, but they were still far from winning the war. Jake sat on a hay bale outside the stall, watching Doc and Martha work, watching Ghost maintain her vigil. He thought about Sarah, about how she would have loved this, the drama and hope of fighting for a life that mattered simply because it existed. She'd always said that Jake had too much love in his heart to keep it all locked away after she was gone, that someday something would come along that would remind him how to feel again. Maybe this was it. This impossible rescue. This tiny foal that refused to die. This albino mare that had known exactly what Jake needed even when he didn't know it himself. Around midnight, something changed. The chestnut opened its eyes, just a crack, and made a sound, tiny and weak, but unmistakably alive. Ghost nickered in response, and Doc Hartley looked up from his monitoring equipment with the first genuine smile Jake had seen on his face all day. "Its temperature's rising," Doc said quietly, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might break the spell. "Just half a degree, but it's rising. I think we might actually pull this off." Jake felt something break open in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 15 years. Tears ran down his weathered face, and he didn't bother wiping them away. Martha put a hand on his shoulder, her own eyes bright with emotion. "You did good today, Jake. Real good." "Ghost did good," he corrected. "I just followed where she led." By dawn, the little chestnut was drinking from a bottle, weak pulls that exhausted it after just a few ounces, but drinking nonetheless. Its eyes were clearer, more focused, and when Jake approached the stall, it lifted its head slightly. Acknowledging his presence, Doc Hartley had dozed off in a chair, his reading glasses still perched on his nose, but Martha remained alert, keeping detailed notes on every measurement, every milestone, building a record that might help them understand what these foals had endured. Jake made breakfast for everyone, simple fare of eggs and toast, but it felt like celebration food given what they'd accomplished. The two ranch hands had stayed through the night despite having their own work waiting, and Jake knew he'd be forever grateful for the kindness of neighbors who understood that some things mattered more than schedules and obligations. They ate in the warm kitchen while snow continued to fall outside, soft and steady, the kind of storm that would have killed the foals if they'd remained in that abandoned barn. Even one more day, Ghost had finally consented to eat her breakfast, though she kept her head turned toward the barn, toward her charges. Jake brought her fresh hay and grain, which she consumed quickly before returning to her post at the stall door. She'd barely slept, as far as Jake could tell, maintaining her watch over the chestnut through the long night. There was something almost mystical about her devotion, this mare who had no biological connection to these foals, but had nonetheless claimed them as her own. The phone rang at 7, startling everyone. It was Sheriff Tom Reeves, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Jake, I heard about what you found yesterday. I need you to tell me everything, and I need that ledger you mentioned to Doc." Jake recounted the story, leaving nothing out, describing the location of the barn, the dead mares, the evidence of an illegal breeding operation. Sheriff Reeves listened without interrupting, but Jake could hear him typing, taking notes, building a case against whoever had committed this crime. When Jake finished, there was a long silence before the sheriff spoke again. "We've been tracking a horse theft ring for 2 years," he said quietly. "High-value breeding stock disappearing from ranches across 3 states. We suspected they were keeping the horses somewhere remote, breeding them, selling the foals without papers for cash, but we could never find their operation. You just handed us the break we needed." "What happens now?" Jake asked. "Now I call the FBI because this crosses state lines. They'll want to process that barn as a crime scene, gather evidence, try to identify the players. But Jake, those foals you rescued, they're probably stolen property, which means legally they belong to whoever their mothers were stolen from." The implications hit Jake like a fist to the gut. He looked out the kitchen window at Ghost standing guard in the barn, at the little chestnut that had nearly died, at Doc Hartley and Martha, who had given up their own time and resources to save creatures they'd never met. The idea that these foals might be taken away, returned to owners who might not care for them properly, who might just see them as insurance claims or breeding stock, made his blood boil. "I understand the law, Sheriff," Jake said carefully, "but these babies have been through hell. They need stability, care, time to recover physically and emotionally. Can you give me some time before this becomes official? How much time are we talking? Enough to make sure they're healthy, make sure. Enough to find out if their original owners even want them back or if they'd rather collect insurance money and let someone who actually gives a damn take over. The sheriff was quiet for another long moment. I can give you 2 weeks before I have to file the official report. That's the best I can do without compromising my badge. But Jake, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that you won't get to keep them. After the call ended, Jake sat at the kitchen table, staring at his cold coffee. Martha came in and poured herself a fresh cup, her expression sympathetic. "You heard all that," he said. It wasn't a question. "I did. And I've seen this before, rescued horses caught up in legal battles, treated like property instead of living beings who've suffered trauma." She sat down across from him. "But I've also seen judges with common sense who understand that what's legal isn't always what's right. Don't give up hope yet." The news from town continued to be encouraging. The 5 foals at the clinic were responding well to treatment, gaining strength with each passing hour. The gray filly that had walked most of the way down the mountain was already showing signs of the personality that starvation had temporarily suppressed. She was bossy, according to the clinic staff, demanding attention and food with an imperious whinny that made everyone laugh. The others were quieter but improving steadily. But it was the little chestnut, the one Jake had privately started calling Chance because that's all it had been given, that captured everyone's heart. By the second day, it was standing on its own, wobbly but determined. By the third day, it was following Ghost around the stall, making the soft nickering sounds that foals use to communicate with their mothers. Ghost had fully adopted the role, allowing Chance to stay close, correcting it gently when it got too rambunctious, standing over it protectively whenever strangers approached. Doc Hartley visited twice a day, amazed by the recovery he was witnessing. "That foal should be dead," he said on the 4th day, watching Chance nurse from a bottle that Jake held. "By every metric we have for measuring survival probability, it should have died in that barn or during transport. But it's not just surviving, it's thriving. That mare of yours is working some kind of magic." "It's not magic," Martha said quietly. She was sitting on a hay bale, updating her notes. "It's love pure, uncomplicated, maternal love. That foal knows it's wanted, knows it's safe, and that's making all the difference." Jake didn't say anything, but he understood what Martha meant. He'd felt that same transformation in himself over the past few days, felt the ice around his heart beginning to thaw. For 15 years he'd been going through the motions of living, taking care of his ranch and his animals, but not really feeling anything beyond the routine satisfaction of work completed. Now watching Ghost mother this orphaned foal, seeing the community come together to save 6 innocent lives, he was remembering what it felt like to care about something beyond mere survival. His daughter called on the 5th day. Having heard about the rescue through the mysterious network of small-town communication that worked faster than any internet dad, she said, and there was something in her voice that made him sit down. "I think you should keep them. The foals, I mean. If you can. Legally, I think you should keep them all." "Honey, I don't know if that's possible. The law says they probably belong to someone else. The law also says that abandoned property can be claimed by whoever finds it, and those foals were definitely abandoned." She paused, and he could hear her taking a breath. "Mom always said the ranch felt empty after I left for college. She wanted you to fill it with life again, with purpose. This is your chance, Dad." After they hung up, Jake walked out to the barn where Ghost and Chance were dozing in the weak winter sunlight that streamed through the window. The little foal's coat was already looking healthier, the dullness giving way to a soft shine that promised beauty once it fully recovered. Ghost opened one eye as Jake approached, then closed it again, completely relaxed, completely content. Maybe his daughter was right. Maybe this was his chance, not just to save 6 foals, but to save himself, to build something new from the ashes of old grief, to honor Sarah's memory by filling their ranch with the life and purpose she'd always envisioned. The legal battles would come, the complications and difficulties that always accompanied doing the right thing. But standing there in his barn, watching his albino mare protect an orphaned foal with fierce devotion, Jake made a decision. He was going to fight to keep these horses, all 6 of them, regardless of what it cost him. The FBI agents arrived on day 7, 2 serious men in dark suits that looked completely out of place in Jake's rural Montana ranch. Special Agent Collins was the older of the 2, a man in his 50s with gray temples and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's darker nature. His partner, Agent Morrison, was younger, maybe 30, with the eager intensity of someone still convinced that justice always prevailed. They spent 3 hours at the abandoned barn, documenting everything, taking photographs, bagging evidence. Then they came to Jake's ranch to ask questions and see the foals that had survived. Collins stood at the stall door where Ghost and Chance dozed together, his expression softening in a way that suggested he wasn't completely hardened by his work. "That's the mare that led you to them?" he asked. And Jake heard something in his voice that wasn't entirely professional. "That's Ghost. Best horse I've ever owned, and I've owned quite a few." Jake moved to stand beside the agent. She knew those foals needed help. Somehow she sensed it from miles away and wouldn't give up until she brought me to them. The agent was quiet for a long moment, watching Ghost's protective posture over the sleeping foal. "My grandmother used to raise horses," he said finally, "back in Kentucky. She always said they were more sensitive than people gave them credit for, that they could feel things we'd lost the ability to sense. I thought it was just old woman talk. But looking at this mare, I'm not so sure." Agent Morrison was less sentimental, focused entirely on building a case against the criminals responsible. "We've identified the dead mares through microchips," he said, consulting his tablet. "All 3 were reported stolen between 8 and 14 months ago from ranches in Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana, high-value breeding stock, worth approximately $30,000 each. The owners filed insurance claims, collected payment, and moved on." "So the foals legally belong to the insurance companies now," Jake said, his heart sinking, "not to the original owners." "It's complicated," Collins interjected. "The insurance companies own the dead mares technically, but these foals were born after the theft, from unauthorized breedings. There's no precedent for ownership in a case like this." He looked at Jake directly. "Which means a judge is going to have to decide, and judges tend to favor whoever can prove they have the animal's best interests at heart." That was the opening Jake needed, and he took it. "These foals have been through hell. They've starved, watched their mothers die, been abandoned in wilderness that would have killed them in another day or 2. What they need now is stability, consistent care, and time to recover both physically and mentally. I can provide that. The insurance companies can't. Can you afford it?" Morrison asked bluntly. "Raising 6 foals isn't cheap. Feed, veterinary care, training costs. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars over the next few years." Jake had been thinking about exactly that question for days. His ranch was profitable but not wealthy. Taking on 6 more horses would strain his resources, require sacrifices he hadn't planned on making. But looking at Ghost and Chance, thinking about the 5 other foals recovering in town, he knew the answer: "I'll find a way. Whatever it takes." Collins exchanged a glance with his partner, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then he pulled out a business card and handed it to Jake. "I'm going to recommend to the court that temporary custody remain with you, pending resolution of the ownership question. That's the best I can do officially." "Unofficially," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've seen a lot of animal cruelty cases in my career. People who treat living creatures as nothing more than profit margins and property. What you did, organizing that rescue, saving these foals, that's the kind of thing that restores my faith in humanity. I hope the judge sees it the same way." After the agents left, Jake called Martha, who had become his unofficial advisor on all things equine rescue. She listened to his account of the meeting, then made a suggestion that hadn't occurred to him. "You need to document everything. Every feeding, every veterinary visit, every improvement in their condition. Build a record that shows you're not just sheltering these foals but actively rehabilitating them. And you need character witnesses, people who can testify that you're the right person to raise these horses." "I'm just a rancher, Martha. I'm not anybody special." "You're the man who dropped everything to save 6 starving foals," she countered. "You're the man whose horse somehow knew they needed help and trusted you enough to ask for it. That makes you pretty damn special in my book." The community rallied in ways that humbled Jake. Feed stores in 3 counties donated hay and grain. Doc Hartley refused to accept payment for his services, declaring that some things were more important than money. The local newspaper ran a story about the rescue that went viral on social media, attracting attention from across the country. Suddenly, Jake's email inbox, which usually contained nothing but spam and the occasional message from his daughter, was flooded with messages from strangers offering support, advice, and donations. A retired equine therapist from California sent a check for $5,000, along with a note that simply said, "For the Foals." A children's charity in New York organized a fundraiser and sent the proceeds. A saddle maker in Texas donated 6 custom halters sized for growing foals, each one engraved with a name chosen by local school children who'd been following the story: Chance, Hope, Faith, Justice, Freedom, and Spirit. And the names seemed almost prophetic, capturing both what the foals had endured and what they represented. By the end of the second week, all 6 foals were healthy enough to be reunited. Jake brought the 5 from the clinic to his ranch, where Ghost greeted each one with the same maternal care she'd shown Chance. His barn, which had felt empty and purposeless for so many years, was suddenly alive with the sounds of young horses learning to be horses again. They played in the snow, discovering joy after weeks of suffering. They nursed from bottles held by volunteers who came daily to help with feedings. They slept in a pile like puppies, drawing comfort from each other's warmth and presence. Jake found himself smiling more than he had in 15 years. He woke up each morning with purpose, knowing that 6 lives depended on him. The routine that had felt deadening before, feeding and cleaning and maintaining, now felt meaningful. He was building something, creating a future for creatures that had been given up for dead, and in saving them, he was somehow saving himself. Ghost remained the center of it all, the matriarch of their unlikely family. She disciplined the foals when they got too rough, comforted them when they were frightened, and stood guard over them while they slept. Jake often found her at night, standing in the center of the barn with foals scattered around her like fallen leaves. Her white coat luminous in the dim light, she looked like a ghost indeed, a spirit guardian watching over her charges. The legal hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks away. After the holidays, Jake spent his evenings preparing testimony, gathering documentation, building the case for why these foals should remain in his care. Martha helped him practice answering difficult questions, playing devil's advocate so he wouldn't be caught off guard. His daughter flew in from Seattle to support him, and for the first time since Sarah's death, the house felt like a home again, filled with conversation and laughter and shared purpose. On Christmas Eve, Jake stood in his barn with his daughter, watching the foals sleep while Ghost maintained her eternal vigil. The snow fell softly outside, covering the world in white peace. "This was what Mom wanted for you," his daughter said quietly. "Not to forget her, but to remember how to live again. To have something to care about beyond just existing." "These horses saved me as much as I saved them," Jake admitted. "Ghost, most of all. She reminded me that love isn't something you run out of. It's something that grows when you give it away. The complications arrived 3 days before the hearing, in the form of a lawyer representing Continental Livestock Insurance Company. His name was Gerald Pemberton, and everything about him, from his $1,000 suit to his calculated smile, set Jake's teeth on edge. He arrived at the ranch in a rented luxury SUV that looked absurd parked next to Jake's battered pickup truck, and he didn't bother hiding his disdain for the mud on his expensive shoes as he picked his way across the yard to the barn. "Mr. Mercer," Pemberton said, extending a hand that Jake shook reluctantly, "I'm here to discuss a settlement regarding the 6 foals currently in your possession." "They're not in my possession," Jake replied carefully. "They're in my care. There's a difference." Pemberton's smile never wavered. "Of course. Semantics aside, my clients have a legitimate claim to those animals. The mothers were insured property, stolen but still legally owned by Continental at the time of the foals' births, which makes the foals assets of Continental as well." Jake led him to the barn where the foals were playing under Ghost's watchful eye. They'd transformed over the past weeks from skeletal, terrified creatures to healthy, spirited youngsters. Chance, the little chestnut that had nearly died, was now the most adventurous of the group, constantly exploring and getting into mischief. Hope, the gray filly, had become Ghost's shadow, mimicking everything the older mare did. The others, Faith, Justice, Freedom, and Spirit, each had their own emerging personalities that made them individuals rather than just interchangeable assets. Pemberton watched them for a moment, his expression unreadable. "They look healthy. You've done good work here." "Thank you," Jake said, waiting for the other shoe to drop, "which is why my clients are prepared to make you a generous offer." Pemberton pulled out a folder from his briefcase. $15,000 for all 6 foals, paid immediately. You sign over any claim to ownership, and we'll find appropriate homes for them. Everyone wins. Jake felt anger rising in his chest like a physical force. "Appropriate homes? You mean you'll sell them to the highest bidder, no questions asked, no background checks, just like the criminals who stole their mothers did? My clients operate a legitimate business, Mr. Mercer. They work with reputable buyers and breeders, like the reputable operation that left these foals to starve in an abandoned barn." Jake's voice was hard. "I'm not interested in your offer, Mr. Pemberton. These horses aren't for sale, and if I have any say in the matter, they're staying right here." Pemberton's smile finally slipped, revealing something cold underneath. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. My clients will win in court. We have the law on our side. Documentation proving ownership of the mares, expert testimony about the economic value of the foals. All you have is sentiment and a good story. I have 6 healthy horses that would be dead if I hadn't found them. I have a community that's rallied to support their rescue. And I have documentation of every single thing I've done to save their lives and rehabilitate them." Jake stepped closer, using his height advantage for the first time in the conversation. "Your clients wrote off those mares as losses and collected insurance money. They have no moral right to these foals, and if there's any justice in this world, the law will recognize that." After Pemberton left, Jake called Martha and recounted the conversation. She was quiet for a long moment, then sighed. "They're trying to intimidate you into settling before the hearing. It's a standard tactic. The fact that they're offering money means they're not as confident about their legal position as they want you to believe." "What do you think my chances are?" Jake asked. "Honestly, 50-50 at best. The law usually favors documented ownership over moral claims. But you've got something on your side that they don't: public opinion and a judge who might just be willing to set a new precedent if you make a compelling enough case." That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He went out to the barn at 2 a.m. and found Ghost awake as always, watching over her sleeping foals. He sat down on a hay bale and told her everything: the lawyer's visit, the settlement offer, his fears about the upcoming hearing. Ghost listened with her characteristic attention, occasionally making soft sounds that felt like understanding. "I don't know if I can win this, girl," Jake said quietly. "But I know I have to try. These babies deserve someone who sees them as more than property, more than assets on a balance sheet. They deserve what you've given them, unconditional love and protection and a chance to just be horses." The day before the hearing, something unexpected happened. Sheriff Reeves called with news that changed everything. "We found him, Jake. The man who ran the breeding operation. His name is Dennis Hargrove, and he's been singing like a canary trying to reduce his sentence." "What did he say?" Jake asked, his heart pounding. "He said the insurance companies knew. Not officially, nothing they could ever prove in court, but they knew horses were being stolen, bred illegally, and sold without papers. They'd turn a blind eye as long as they got their premiums and could occasionally collect on a theft claim. It was a perfect scam, profitable for everyone involved except the horses and their legitimate owners." "Can you prove it?" Jake demanded. "We're working on it." "But Jake, this changes the hearing. If we can show that Continental benefited from the criminal enterprise that nearly killed those foals, their claim to ownership becomes a lot less sympathetic." Jake felt hope surge through him for the first time since Pemberton's visit. "What do you need from me?" "Just be ready to tell your story tomorrow. The whole story, nothing held back. Let the judge see those foals through your eyes, understand what they've been through, and what they need going forward. Leave the legal maneuvering to me and the prosecutor's office." That evening, Jake's daughter helped him pick out clothes for the hearing, insisting that he needed to look presentable, even though he protested that a judge should care more about actions than appearance. They settled on his good jeans, clean boots, a pressed shirt, and the sport coat he'd worn to Sarah's funeral, the only formal clothing he owned. His daughter stood back and examined him critically, then nodded her approval. "You look like what you are," she said. "A good man who did the right thing when it mattered most. That's all you need to be tomorrow." The foals seemed to sense something was different. They were quieter than usual during evening feeding, staying close to Ghost instead of playing their usual rough-and-tumble games. Chance, the little chestnut that had become Jake's special favorite, stood at the stall door and whinnied when Jake prepared to leave the barn. For the night, Jake returned and spent a few minutes stroking the foal's neck, feeling the trust in the way it leaned into his hand. "No matter what happens tomorrow," Jake whispered, "you're going to be okay, all of you. I promise." Ghost pushed her nose into Jake's chest, her breath warm against him in the cold barn air. He wrapped his arms around her neck and stood there for a long moment, drawing strength from her presence. This mare had started everything, had known somehow that Jake needed the foals as much as they needed him. She'd led him on a journey that had transformed his life, pulling him out of grief and isolation and giving him purpose again. Walking back to the house, Jake looked up at the stars scattered across the black Montana sky. Somewhere up there, he liked to think Sarah was watching, proud of what he'd become in her absence. Not the broken man who'd spent 15 years merely existing, but someone who'd remembered how to fight for what mattered, how to love without fear of loss, how to build something beautiful from tragedy and abandonment. Tomorrow would determine whether the foals stayed or were taken away by insurance company lawyers who saw them only as assets to be liquidated. But regardless of the outcome, Jake knew that Ghost had already given him the greatest gift possible, the reminder that healing was possible, that new beginnings could emerge from the ashes of old endings, and that sometimes the most important rescues were the ones where you couldn't tell who was saving whom. The courtroom in Missoula was smaller than Jake had expected, more like a conference room than the grand chambers he'd seen on television. Judge Patricia Henshaw presided from behind a modest desk, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed the case files. She was in her 60s, Jake guessed, with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd heard every excuse and argument the legal system could produce. The gallery was packed. Martha sat directly behind Jake, along with Doc Hartley and at least 20 other volunteers who'd helped with the rescue. His daughter held his hand, squeezing it gently when the judge called the court to order. On the other side of the aisle, Gerald Pemberton sat with two other lawyers from Continental Insurance, their expensive suits and leather briefcases radiating corporate confidence. Judge Henshaw looked up from her papers and surveyed the crowded room with raised eyebrows. "This is a custody hearing for 6 horses. Not a murder trial. I wasn't expecting quite so much public interest." "Your Honor," Sheriff Reeves stood from his seat, "those 6 horses represent something important to this community. The people here have a stake in the outcome." "Noted, Sheriff." The judge turned her attention to the lawyers. "This is an unusual case with no clear precedent. We have stolen property that was subsequently abandoned, offspring born during that abandonment, and competing claims of ownership from an insurance company and a private citizen who effected the rescue." She looked at Pemberton. "The insurance company may present its case first." Pemberton stood, his performance polished and practiced. "Your Honor, this is actually quite simple. Despite Mr. Mercer's emotional attachment to the animals in question, Continental Livestock Insurance paid legitimate claims on 3 stolen mares. Under the law, that makes us the legal owners of those mares and any offspring produced while they were stolen property. The foals represent approximately $40,000 in potential value, assets that belong to my clients. While we appreciate Mr. Mercer's humanitarian efforts, the law is clear about property rights. He presented documentation, insurance policies, payment records, expert testimony about the foals' bloodlines and market value. It was clinical, professional, and completely devoid of any acknowledgement that they were discussing living creatures who had suffered. Jake felt his hands clenching into fists, and his daughter placed a calming hand on his arm. When Pemberton finished, Judge Henshaw turned to Jake. "Mr. Mercer, I understand you're representing yourself. Are you prepared to present your case?" Jake stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. He wasn't a lawyer, had no experience with courtrooms or legal arguments. All he had was the truth and the hope that it would be enough. "Your Honor, I'm just a rancher. I don't have fancy words or legal degrees. But I know horses, and I know what those 6 foals went through. They watched their mothers die. They starved for weeks in an abandoned barn. Another day and they would have been dead too." He described the rescue in detail, Ghost's inexplicable insistence on leading him into the wilderness, the condition of the foals when they were found, the round-the-clock care required to save them. He pulled out photographs, medical records, testimonials from Doc Hartley and the clinic staff. He showed the judge the fundraising letters from children across the country, the donations from strangers who believed in giving these horses a second chance. "Continental Insurance wants to treat them like assets," Jake said, his voice growing stronger. "But they're not assets, Your Honor. They're survivors. They've learned to trust again after being abandoned. They've formed bonds with each other and with my mare Ghost. Tearing them away now, selling them off to whoever pays the highest price, that would be another trauma, on top of everything they've already endured." Judge Henshaw was making notes, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Pemberton, do your clients have specific plans for these foals if custody is awarded to them?" Pemberton stood again, smooth as silk. "We have several reputable buyers lined up, Your Honor. Breeding farms that specialize in quality stock. Families looking for pleasure horses. Each foal would be placed in an appropriate home." "Would those placements be together or separate?" the judge asked. "Likely separate," Pemberton admitted. "Different buyers have different needs. So these foals, who have bonded with each other after shared trauma, would be split up and sold to strangers." The judge's tone was sharp. "That's standard practice in the industry, Your Honor. The foals' emotional attachments are less important than ensuring they're placed with qualified owners." Sheriff Reeves stood suddenly. "Your Honor, if I may, I have new information relevant to this case." Judge Henshaw frowned. "Sheriff, this isn't a criminal proceeding. No, ma'am, but it touches on the insurance company's claim of legitimate ownership. We've arrested Dennis Hargrove, the man who ran the illegal breeding operation. He's provided testimony suggesting that Continental Insurance was aware of the theft ring and may have indirectly profited from it. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Pemberton shot to his feet, his composure finally cracking. That's an outrageous accusation with no evidentiary basis. My clients operate with complete integrity. Judge Henshaw banged her gavel. Order. Sheriff Reeves, this is highly irregular. Do you have proof of these allegations? We're building a case, Your Honor. I can't share all the details in open court, but I can tell you that the FBI is investigating Continental's claims department for possible conspiracy and fraud. The investigation is ongoing. The judge was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers before her. Then she looked directly at Jake. Mr. Mercer, if I were to award you custody of these foals, what would be your long-term plan for them? Jake hadn't expected the question, but the answer came easily. I'd keep them together, at least until they're old enough to be trained properly. They need stability, consistency. My ranch can provide that, eventually. When they're ready, I'd find them good homes if that's what's best for them, or keep them if I can afford it. But every decision would be made with their welfare as the priority, not profit. And you understand that raising 6 horses is an expensive long-term commitment. You're 62 years old, Mr. Mercer. What happens to these horses if something happens to you? My daughter has agreed to take responsibility for them if I'm unable to continue their care, Jake said. We've put that in writing, and the community has shown they're willing to help with costs. This isn't just about me, Your Honor. It's about what's right. Judge Henshaw removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. This court will take a 15-minute recess while I consider my decision. Those 15 minutes felt like hours. Jake stood outside the courtroom with Martha and his daughter, unable to sit still. Doc Hartley joined them, his weathered face grave. You did everything you could, Jake. The rest is up to the judge now. When they were called back in, Judge Henshaw's expression gave nothing away. She waited until everyone was seated before speaking, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. I've spent 30 years on the bench, and I've learned that the law isn't always synonymous with justice. This is one of those cases where following the letter of the law would produce an outcome that violates its spirit. The judge's words hung in the air as Jake held his breath, afraid to hope, afraid to assume anything from her preamble. Judge Henshaw continued, her voice measured but firm. Continental Insurance claims legal ownership based on insurance payments made for stolen property. But those claims were closed, written off, and paid out. The company moved on, considering the matter settled. They showed no interest in these foals until Mr. Mercer's rescue made them valuable again. That's not ownership. That's opportunism. Pemberton stood. Your Honor, we must object. The law clearly states that... I know what the law states. Mr. Pemberton, Judge Henshaw's tone could have frozen water. I also know that your clients are under FBI investigation for possible involvement in the very criminal enterprise that created this situation. Until that investigation is complete, I'm not inclined to hand over 6 vulnerable animals to an entity that may have profited from their mother's theft and their subsequent abandonment. She turned her attention to Jake. Mr. Mercer, this court awards you full custody of all 6 foals, with the stipulation that you provide quarterly reports on their health and welfare for the next 2 years. Should Continental Insurance be cleared of any wrongdoing in the FBI investigation, they may petition to revisit this decision. But for now, those horses stay with you. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Jake felt his daughter throw her arms around him, felt Martha pounding him on the back, heard Doc Hartley's loud whoop of celebration. He stood frozen for a moment, unable to process what had just happened, unable to believe that the battle was actually over. The judge banged her gavel, calling for order, but she was smiling, the first genuine smile Jake had seen from her all day. Pemberton gathered his papers with angry, jerky movements, his carefully maintained composure completely shattered. As he stormed out of the courtroom, his associates following like ducklings, Sheriff Reeves caught Jake's eye and winked. That FBI investigation had just become the most valuable tool they could have asked for, regardless of whether it ultimately proved Continental's complicity. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting, alerted by social media posts from people who'd been in the gallery. Jake found himself surrounded by microphones and cameras, questions being shouted from every direction. His daughter stepped in smoothly, handling the media with the professional ease of someone who worked in corporate communications. Yes, her father was thrilled with the decision. No, he wouldn't be making any further statements at this time. Yes, people could continue to donate to the Foals' care through the fund that had been established. Thank you. No more questions. In the truck driving home, Jake finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The Foals were his legally, officially, permanently his unless Continental was cleared and chose to fight again. But even if they did, he'd bought time. Given the Foals months or years of stability and care, that was worth everything. "You're crying, Dad," his daughter said gently. Jake wiped his eyes, surprised to find his cheeks wet. "I didn't think we'd win. I hoped, but I didn't think it was actually possible." "Mom knew you'd win." His daughter's voice was soft but certain. "She always said you were the most stubborn man alive when it came to protecting things you loved. She'd be so proud of you right now." The ranch was exactly as they'd left it that morning, but somehow it looked different to Jake. Not just property now, but a sanctuary, a place where 6 horses who'd been abandoned and left to die could heal and grow and eventually thrive. Ghost was waiting at the fence, as if she'd known the outcome before they'd returned. The foals were scattered around the pasture, playing in the snow, completely unaware that their entire future had just been decided in a courtroom 50 miles away. Jake stood at the fence for a long moment, watching them. Chance was chasing Faith around a hay feeder, both of them kicking up their heels with pure joy. Hope stood next to Ghost, mirroring the older mare's stance so perfectly it was almost comical. Justice, freedom, and spirit were wrestling in the snow, their play becoming more confident and vigorous each day as they left starvation and trauma further behind. That evening, the celebration at Jake's ranch was everything Sarah would have loved. Neighbors brought food, friends brought music, and someone even brought champagne, though most people stuck to beer and coffee. The barn was warm and bright, decorated with lights that Martha had strung up while they'd been at the hearing. The foals watched the party from their stalls, ears pricked forward with interest, accepting treats and attention from the steady stream of visitors who wanted to see the famous rescued horses. Doc Hartley raised his glass in a toast to Jake Mercer, who proved that one stubborn man with a conscience can beat corporate lawyers and bureaucratic nonsense. And to Ghost, the mare who started it all by refusing to give up on horses nobody knew existed. Everyone cheered and drank, and Jake felt something warm spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the beer. This was community, real community. People who showed up when it mattered, who fought for what was right even when it was inconvenient or expensive or difficult. He'd been part of this community for decades, but somehow he'd forgotten what it meant until Ghost had led him into those mountains. As the party wound down and people began heading home, promising to help with spring feeding and fence repairs, Jake found himself alone in the barn with Ghost and the foals. His daughter had gone to bed, exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of the day. The foals were settling down for the night, arranging themselves in their usual pile in the corner of the large stall. Ghost stood apart, watching them with those intelligent eyes. Jake moved to stand beside her, running his hand along her neck. "You knew, didn't you, girl? Somehow you knew exactly what I needed, what they needed, how to bring us all together. The mare turned her head and rested it against his chest, her breath warm and steady. Jake wrapped his arms around her neck and stood there in the quiet barn, surrounded by the soft sounds of sleeping horses, feeling more at peace than he had since Sarah's death. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it no longer filled every corner of his existence. There was room now for joy, for purpose, for the daily satisfaction of caring for creatures who depended on him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The FBI investigation would continue, and there was always the possibility that Continental would find a way to fight back. The foals would need training as they grew, careful handling to ensure they didn't develop the fear and mistrust that their early trauma might have instilled. The ranch finances would be tight, with 6 extra mouths to feed and veterinary bills that would stretch his budget. But standing there in his barn with Ghost and 6 rescued foals, Jake knew he could handle whatever came. He'd found his purpose again, and that was worth more than all the insurance settlements and legal victories in the world. Spring came to Montana with the sudden intensity that only those who'd survived the winter could fully appreciate. The snow melted from Jake's pastures, revealing grass that had waited patiently beneath the white blanket. The foals, now nearly a year old, had transformed from the skeletal, terrified creatures he'd found in that abandoned barn. They were strong and healthy, their coats gleaming, their eyes bright with curiosity and trust that had been painstakingly rebuilt over months of consistent care. The FBI investigation had concluded 3 months after the custody hearing. Continental Livestock Insurance was found guilty of conspiracy and fraud, their claims department having knowingly profited from the theft ring for years. The company paid massive fines and several executives faced criminal charges. Gerald Pemberton had resigned, his career in ruins. The case became a landmark in animal welfare law, establishing precedent for abandonment claims and rescue custody that would affect cases for years to come. Jake had received an official letter from the court declaring his custody of the foals permanent and unconditional. The quarterly reports were no longer required, though he continued them anyway, documenting the foals' progress for his own records and for the hundreds of people who continued to follow their story online. His daughter had helped him set up a simple website where supporters could see photos and read updates, and the response had been overwhelming. The donations continued to arrive, enough that Jake had been able to build a second barn specifically for the foals, with spacious stalls and a heated tack room. He'd hired a young trainer named Rebecca, who specialized in trauma recovery for horses, and together they were working with each foal individually, building confidence and skills at a pace that respected their difficult start in life. Chance, the little chestnut who'd nearly died in Jake's barn that first night, had become the boldest of the group, the first to try anything new, the one who led the others in their daily adventures around the pasture. Hope, the gray filly who'd walked most of the way down from that mountain, had fulfilled her early promise. She was smart and willing, with a natural athleticism that suggested she'd excel at whatever discipline she eventually trained for. Faith, justice, freedom, and spirit. Each had their own personalities, their own strengths and challenges. But what united them all was the bond they shared, forged in suffering and maintained through the security Jake and Ghost had provided. Ghost remained the matriarch, though the foals were now nearly as tall as she was. She still watched over them with maternal devotion, still corrected them when they got too rowdy, still stood guard while they slept. But there was something different about her now, a contentment that went beyond simple satisfaction. She'd found her purpose, and in doing so, she'd given Jake his. On a morning in late May, Jake stood at the pasture fence watching the herd graze. His daughter was visiting again, bringing her husband and their 2 children, Jake's grandchildren, who came running up to press their faces against the rails, squealing with delight at the horses. The foals, now accustomed to visitors, approached cautiously, accepting the apple slices the children offered with gentle lips. Grandpa, the younger one, a girl of 5 named Emma, asked. Which one almost died? Jake lifted her up so she could see better. That chestnut one there with the white stripe down his face, that's Chance. When I found him, he was so weak he could barely lift his head. Now look at him. They watched as Chance trotted over, his movement fluid and powerful, no sign remaining of the starvation that had nearly killed him. Emma reached out, and Chance allowed her to touch his nose, his trust in humans completely restored. How did you know where to find them? Emma asked with the directness of children. I didn't, honey. Ghost knew. Jake gestured to the albino mare, who stood slightly apart from the others, watching with her characteristic alertness. She led me right to them, like she could sense they needed help even though they were miles away in the mountains. That's magic, Emma declared with absolute certainty. Jake smiled. Maybe it is. Or maybe it's just love. Sometimes they're the same thing. That afternoon, after his daughter's family had left and the ranch had returned to its peaceful routine, Jake saddled Ghost for a ride. They followed the same trail they'd taken that November morning, nearly 7 months ago, when his life had changed forever. The forest was different in spring, green and alive with birdsong, but the path was familiar. They climbed steadily, Ghost's stride as strong and sure as ever, until they reached the meadow where the abandoned barn still stood. Jake had been back several times, helping the FBI document everything, working with other volunteers to remove the dead mares and give them proper burial. The barn itself was scheduled for demolition, deemed too dangerous to restore and too painful to preserve. But today it still stood, a monument to suffering and survival, to the darkness that humans were capable of and the light that could shine through when good people chose to act. He dismounted and led Ghost to the spot where he'd first found the foals. Spring flowers grew there now, purple lupine and yellow balsam root, life reclaiming space that death had held too long. Ghost lowered her head and blew softly, as if remembering, as if paying respect to the mothers who hadn't survived and the foals who had. Thank you, Jake said quietly to the mare, for being stubborn, for not giving up, for showing me that there was still something worth fighting for. Ghost raised her head and looked at him with those remarkable eyes, and Jake would have sworn she understood every word. They stood together in the meadow for a long time, man and horse, bound by a journey that had saved more than just 6 foals. It had saved Jake too, pulled him from the grief and isolation that had threatened to define his remaining years, given him purpose and community, and the reminder that love wasn't something you ran out of or lost forever. It was something that grew when you gave it away, that multiplied when you opened your heart to creatures who needed you. Thus, the ride home was peaceful, the afternoon sun warm on Jake's face. As they approached the ranch, he could see the foals waiting at the fence, could hear their welcoming whinnies carrying across the distance. This was home now, not just for him, but for 7 horses who had all found their way here through different paths, different traumas, different miracles. That evening, as the sun set behind the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Jake stood in his barn, watching the herd settle for the night. The foals had eaten their dinner and were beginning their usual routine of arranging themselves for sleep. Ghost stood in the center of them, white coat luminous in the fading light, guardian and mother and friend. Jake thought about the journey that had brought them all here, about the mysterious bond between humans and horses that transcended logic or explanation. He thought about Sarah, about how she would have loved every moment of this adventure, how she would have cried and cheered and insisted they make room for even more rescued animals. He thought about the community that had rallied to save 6 starving foals, about the judge who'd chosen justice over strict interpretation of law, about the hundreds of strangers who'd sent money and encouragement to support animals they'd never meet. But mostly he thought about Ghost, about the albino mare who had known somehow that abandoned foals were dying in a mountain wilderness, who had refused to accept Jake's initial dismissal of her behavior, who had led him on a journey that had changed everything. People called it instinct or coincidence or luck. Jake knew it was something more. It was the kind of love that didn't ask questions or calculate costs, that simply acted because action was necessary, that believed in the possibility of salvation even when logic suggested it was impossible. The stars began appearing in the darkening sky, and Jake made his way to the house, leaving the barn door open so the cool spring air could circulate behind him. Ghost nickered softly to her charges, a sound of comfort and safety and home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, the endless cycle of care that raising horses required. But tonight, standing on the threshold between his barn and his house, Jake Mercer was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, surrounded by the living proof that one person's determination, guided by one horse's inexplicable knowledge, could change the world for 6 creatures who had been forgotten by everyone, except the mare who had known they existed and the man who had trusted her enough to follow.